One recorded statement, one sealed folder carried out of the king's office, one signature line that simply stopped appearing on the paperwork. That is the entire story. I'm going to take those three things apart in the order they happened, because the sequence is where the logic starts to fray. The claims arrived first from people close to the royal household, and they arrived hard. They said the king's cancer was incurable and that he would live with the disease for whatever time remained rather than emerge on the other side of it. I will treat that claim with care throughout this account. A living man's health is not something anyone should repeat as settled fact. The monarchy did not shift because of rumor. Rumors had circulated for 2 years, and the institution had absorbed every version of them. It moved because Princess Anne spoke the words out loud. She confirmed, in a controlled statement that carried her characteristic steel, that the abdication process was complete and that William was preparing to step forward as the working center of the crown. Abdication, in plain terms, means a monarch surrenders the throne while still alive, closing one reign so the next can begin. No British monarch has done it since 1936. Anne did not soften a single word. She delivered the confirmation through a recorded private statement prepared for senior royal officials. That is a very particular choice. A recording preserves every word and every pause. No one in that building can later claim she was misunderstood. She was making denial impossible. A recording is what you reach for when you no longer trust the room. Anne has spent 55 years working inside that household without ever needing a document to back her word. This time, she wanted a tape. Charles received the final confirmation in silence. He stood near the desk where weeks of sealed meetings, private family consultations, and tightened palace communications had all been leading to the same conclusion. He placed one hand flat on the edge of the wood, nothing ceremonial about the gesture, and he was not unsteady on his feet. History had grown heavy in his hands, and he needed somewhere to set part of the weight down. Consider what that man had spent his life doing. He waited longer than any heir in British history. He was 73 when his mother died at Balmoral on 8 September 2022. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on 6 May 2023. Buckingham Palace announced the cancer diagnosis in February 2024, and he was back on public duties by April, faster than his doctors wanted, and everyone around him knew it. Now the same duty that had carried him to the throne was asking him to hand it over while he was still standing in the room. William heard Anne's words and did not smile. Those present described the sentence landing before his heart was ready for it. He understood why the confirmation had to exist. Hesitation at the very top weakens trust, confuses the household, and leaves a country unsure who holds authority. William has done a version of this once before. At 15, on 6 September 1997, he walked behind Diana's coffin while a million people watched a boy carry something no boy should have to carry. He learned then what the institution requires of a young man who must hold himself together in public. He was about to do it again, this time for the other parent. The clarity arrived wrapped in grief. William was not stepping over his father. He was stepping into the space his father was being forced to leave. There is no version of that a son enjoys. That is the pattern in this family, and it has never once broken. The private decision is taken quietly, then someone must stand before the country as the face of it, and it is never the person who made the decision. Anne stopped being a messenger somewhere in the middle of that week. She became the stabilizing witness, the one person whose word no one would question, stating aloud that this was not speculation, not palace noise, not another storm that would pass in a fortnight. She had watched the strain build in Charles, the pressure gather around William, and the silence around Catherine. Titles do not move power in that building. Paper moves power, and everyone who works there can read the paper faster than they can read a face. Then a sealed folder marked for immediate royal review left the king's office and entered the prince's private team. Everyone who saw it cross that corridor understood the message without explanation. Power had already moved. The paperwork was simply catching up. That confirmation did not only place responsibility on William, it opened every fracture in the family at once. Charles looked broken by the surrender. William looked flattened by the arrival. Anne looked hardened by necessity. Somewhere behind another closed door, one more person was beginning to feel betrayed. Before the crown could face the country, It had to survive the 5 people standing closest to it. Charles felt it first because the decision cut through the shape of his entire life. He had waited longer than any modern heir to wear the crown, and the duty that had lifted him was now asking him to set it down. Handing it over was not leaving a job. It was accepting, in front of his family, that the institution needed a steadier future than he could still provide. William understood that the future had turned toward him at brutal speed. He lost the protection of distance, of patience, of someday, all in the same week. He became the man everyone looked to for order, roughly a decade earlier than anyone had planned. Catherine stood near him with the quiet that only comes from practice. His controlled expression slipped for a second, and she reached for his hand before anyone else noticed. She knew exactly why it mattered. If he broke open in front of the household, the family would feel it within an hour. If he went cold to stop himself breaking, the country would feel that instead, and it would take years to undo. Anne watched her brother with a sister's pain rather than a judge's flat face. She delivered the confirmation and escaped none of its cost. She knew what the monarchy had taken from Charles across 77 years, and she knew precisely what it was about to begin taking from William. Camilla had spent 20 years learning to read rooms like that one. She entered the family through the worst press any incoming royal has ever faced, outlasted every prediction, and reached the seat beside the sovereign by noticing details others walked past. She did not move when the first sign appeared. She watched a senior aide quietly remove one chair from the council room layout, and that small movement told her what no one was willing to say aloud. Her place beside Charles remained personal. The machinery had already stopped running through her. The pain in that room did not appear overnight. The sequence matters. To understand why Anne's confirmation carried the force it did, the story has to return to the incident the palace tried hardest to bury. The point of no return did not arrive at a ceremony. It arrived behind a closed door at Windsor during a private succession briefing arranged to calm everyone down. One sentence from Charles froze the room. One reaction from William changed the temperature. One decision from Anne set the path toward abdication. Windsor is where this family goes when something must not leak. Charles walked into that briefing trying to hold the center. The meeting was meant to produce calm. It produced the opposite inside about 11 minutes. Emergency leadership transfer papers sat in front of him, waiting for one signature. Documents that move key royal authority quickly when a crisis will not wait for ordinary process. Everyone in the room had watched him sign 1,000 documents. He signs quickly, the way of a man who has been signing things since his 20s and stopped reading most of them long ago. Charles reached for the pen, stopped, and looked away. 2 seconds, maybe 3. In a room with 4 people and a recording device switched off, that pause changed everything that followed. The king was not refusing his duty. He hesitated at the exact moment the crown needed certainty in front of his sister and his heir, and William saw him do it. The prince did not raise his voice, which made it worse. He stood across the table and asked whether the delay was about duty or about fear. Those words went through the room like dropped glass. Charles's face tightened, not pure anger. A man had been seen too clearly by his own son, at 77, holding a pen he could not put down on the paper. William stepped back slightly. In that small movement, Anne understood the wound had opened and that the future king had recognized something dangerous. Waiting can become its own kind of risk. She did not interrupt. She watched Charles with a sister's sorrow and William with a protector's alarm, then she wrote it down. In a documented private account prepared for the family record, the Princess Royal set out that the crown could no longer operate in uncertainty. That is the piece of paper this entire story rests on. Uncertainty at the top does not stay at the top. It travels down through aides, schedules, invitations, public trust, and every person in 3 palaces waiting to learn who is in command. Catherine heard about the briefing that same night. Her reaction changed Anne's mind about the future. She did not panic when told William might have to prepare sooner than expected. She asked one question, what he would need in order to carry it. Anne heard that answer and something settled. The next reign would not stand on William alone. The confrontation that followed did not need raised voices. Charles and William entered the private room as king and heir. Inside 4 minutes, they were a father and a son standing across years of pressure neither had ever put into words. Anne waited outside. Catherine stayed nearby. Behind one closed door, the future of the British monarchy came down to a conversation no courtier was allowed to soften. Anne's documented memorandum after the Windsor briefing had cut through every remaining excuse. Waiting any longer would damage the crown more than an abdication would. For Charles, the warning landed because he could follow the consequences himself. Uncertainty weakens the household, confuses the country, and leaves William inheriting chaos instead of a working institution. William arrived with no aids and no prepared language. He had decided leadership could not remain suspended between them. He later described it as pain wearing the mask of duty. Charles looked at him and said that nobody is ever ready to inherit the loneliness of the throne. That line is worth sitting with. Charles knows that loneliness better than any living person. He watched it take his mother's private life and dismantle his marriage to Diana across the front pages of every newspaper in Britain through the 1990s. He had spent the last few years trying to ensure his son inherited something warmer. William put his hand on the back of a chair and did not sit down, one gesture carrying respect and refusal at the same time. Still a son, already the future king. He told his father the country could not wait for perfect readiness and that the palace had already begun moving around a decision everyone could feel and no one would name. Charles absorbed it slowly. The silence grew heavier than any argument. Then he admitted what Anne had forced into the open. She was right. The institution needed one hand, one voice, one direction. The abdication papers had to be treated as complete. He did not say it with relief. Those present describe a man letting go of the life he had been walking toward since boyhood, doing it aloud in front of his son with the door shut. William stood there understanding that his father's ending had become his beginning. Then Charles asked for one promise: saving the crown must not destroy the family. William did not answer at once. He knew Camilla would feel the shift and have nowhere to put it. He knew Catherine would carry the strain beside him for the rest of their lives. He knew Anne had already paid the price of becoming the voice that made it final. He looked at his father and promised that firmness would not turn into cruelty. That is where the confrontation changed. Charles stopped fighting the future. William stopped waiting for permission to walk into it. Peace did not spread through the palace. One door opened for William, another began closing around Camilla. The temperature dropped inside 48 hours. Power in a palace almost never moves with noise. It moves through the order of morning briefings, a phone call routed to a different office, a private secretary standing outside a door he used not to stand outside. After Anne's confirmation, the machinery turned toward William at once. Charles was still there, still respected, still the king in every room he entered. The center of gravity had simply moved somewhere else, and the staff felt it before anyone was told. William's office received the first signs. Transition briefings began arriving under his name. Household authority schedules stopped going to Charles for final review. A palace cannot run on sentiment. Staff need one chain of command. The country needs one direction. The prince was suddenly being treated as both. Anne backed the shift because she had decided delay had become more dangerous than pain. She had watched confusion spread through that household before. She pushed not from lack of compassion, but because a wounded institution still has to stand upright in front of a country. Camilla sat with Charles after the briefing order changed. Her voice was quieter than anger, which is usually worse. She asked whether there was still a place for her voice in whatever came next. Charles looked at her with sadness rather than blame. He knew the abdication had changed more than signatures. It had changed access, influence, closeness, and the rhythm of every private room in his life. Then William received the document that made the whole thing real. A senior courtier handed over the first official schedule issued under the prince's authority in silence. The important part was not what appeared on that schedule, it was what had gone. The approval line at the bottom of those documents exists for one purpose: the sovereign's final sign-off. Nothing binding leaves that household without it. For 3 years, every page had carried Charles's name. The line was gone. Someone had removed the king's approval field from the template rather than leave it blank. A blank space invites a question, a missing field does not. The prince was no longer preparing for responsibility. He was already sitting inside it, and the paperwork had stopped pretending otherwise. Catherine's name appeared beside William's in the private planning notes. Nobody puts a name there for decoration. She was being written in as part of the steadiness the next monarchy would be built on. She understood that a reign opening with pressure, grief and family fracture cannot run on discipline alone. William would need partnership, and someone who could read a silence before it became a crisis. By morning, the palace had stopped preparing for change. It was living inside it. Corridors went quiet. Staff moved fast and said less. Charles stayed behind one door. William prepared behind another. Catherine, watching the first schedule of the new order come through, understood that the crown had not passed forward cleanly. It had left wounds on the way past. William's team began receiving leadership decisions before the household had emotionally caught up. Security summaries, national briefing material, private schedules, all moved toward the prince with a coldness that had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with process. Leadership had stopped being symbolic overnight. Charles read the first revised timetable in silence. Fewer direct approvals from him, more decisions routed straight to William's office. He set it down without a word. People in the room describe a man visibly struck by how fast the world had moved on. For 50 years, every major royal path in Britain had bent toward Charles. Now the palace was bending away, politely, efficiently, and in about a fortnight. Court circular totals for the previous year showed him on 532 official engagements, more than anyone else in the family. At 76, 18 months after a cancer announcement, he was still respected, still protected, still loved by those closest to him. Operational influence had begun running out of his hands anyway, and no amount of respect slows that process. Catherine found William alone before his first expanded briefing and read his face before he spoke. He did not look proud. He looked flattened by the speed of it. She knew what rode on the next hour. If he walked into that room shaken, the household would feel the tremor by lunchtime. If he walked in cold, they would fear the future instead. She also knew what happens to a woman standing beside a Prince of Wales when the institution decides she is a problem. Diana entered that position at 20 and left it stripped of the HRH in August 1996. Catherine married into the family knowing the whole of that story and has spent every year since ensuring the next version runs differently. Anne moved fast because hesitation had already cost the family more than anyone wanted to add up. She instructed senior aides through a recorded internal direction that there would be no mixed message from any office. The abdication was complete. William was to be treated as the monarchy's active lead. She knew what unclear authority does inside those walls. Panic, then leaks, then households briefing against each other. That last one nearly finished the monarchy once already. She also knew Charles would suffer from the clarity. She decided the crown would suffer more without it, and she said so on the record. Camilla declined an early meeting when the invitation came. She chose silence over confrontation. She was not confident of winning, the most revealing decision she made in the sequence. She understood the palace was reorganizing around William and that her husband's household had stopped being the center of anything. Her silence was not peace. It was resistance held behind closed lips, and everyone in the building read it correctly. Before he faced the country, William went to the one person who could still reach him as a man rather than a position. In a private room with no aides and no cameras, he spoke not like a future king, but like a husband who understood his life had changed shape permanently. He had walked out of formal preparation because the noise inside his head had grown too loud. Every line being handed to him now carried the force of a new reign. Catherine knew strength without feeling would only make him colder, and cold is what kills that family from the inside. He said the thing he had been holding since the Windsor briefing. He never wanted the throne to arrive through his father's pain. He never wanted Charles's surrender to be his own beginning. Catherine answered with the only thing that would have worked. Duty rarely arrives gently. Leadership was not about replacing Charles. It was about carrying forward the part that has to survive. William admitted the fear underneath every controlled sentence that week, that the family would fracture, that Camilla would be isolated, that his father would feel erased. Catherine reminded him that firmness does not have to become cruelty. The next monarchy could be disciplined without being cold, clear without being heartless, strong without humiliating those who had stepped back. She gave the shape of his reign to him in a private room in about 4 sentences. He listened because she was speaking to the man underneath the crown, and he has spent his whole life being addressed as the other thing. That conversation did not lighten the weight. It steadied him. Then he walked out to face a country that had already heard. By the time the news reached the public, it no longer felt like palace gossip. It felt like history arriving at the front door. Britain took it with disbelief, grief, pride and fear in roughly that order inside about 6 hours. The palace released its confirmation after Anne's statement with no softening. The abdication process was complete. William was entering active leadership now. Broadcasters treated it with the seriousness normally reserved for national emergency. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowd gathered without the usual noise. Some held flags, most kept their phones at their sides. They stood looking at the gates as though the building itself might come out and explain. The silence is the detail that stayed with me. Those crowds are never silent. The country had come looking for certainty and found something closer to a funeral. One woman near the front wiped her eyes while speaking to a broadcaster. She said Charles had waited all his life and now the crown had asked him to let it go. Her words traveled because she had said the thing official language could not. The crown had not moved cleanly from father to son. It had taken something from both of them on the way across. One national front page carried 3 words over a photograph of the palace gates at dawn. William steps forward. Read aloud, it does not sound like celebration. It sounds like a sentence being handed down. Now to the point I promised at the beginning. The sentence that went round the country was the abdication. That is what every broadcaster led on and every front page carried. It is not the sentence Anne used first. Her recorded statement opened with the reason before it reached the process. She set out that the household had been operating for months on a private understanding about the king's health, an understanding never written into any document because no one was willing to be the person who wrote it down. 4 words had been used inside that household. Somebody put them into a draft account of a senior meeting and somebody else struck them out before circulation. We fear the worst. That is the phrase Anne would not allow to remain struck. Once she said the reason aloud on a recording prepared for senior officials, the abdication stopped being a decision anyone could argue about. It became the only available arithmetic. I want to be exact. Nobody outside a very small group knows the king's medical position, and I will not pretend I do. Buckingham Palace announced a cancer diagnosis in February 2024 and has never given a stage, type, or prognosis. Charles returned to public duties in April 2024 and carried 532 engagements the following year. Those are the facts on the record. The medical claim is not what shook Britain. Speculation about his health had been circulating for 2 years. The country moved because Anne said the quiet reason out loud on a recording deliberately so that no one in that building could walk it back. There is no reversal at the end of this one. Charles gave up the role he had walked toward his entire life. William accepted a weight he could no longer postpone. Anne became the witness who forced clarity into a room where silence had turned dangerous. Catherine became the calm standing next to the storm. The monarchy survived because every one of them paid something for it. William went to see his father privately after the public confirmation. For once the prince did not speak first. He stood beside Charles until the silence softened enough to hold something. Charles looked at him with the tired dignity of a man who had stopped fighting the inevitable. The king kept his standing and lost his reign. Duty sometimes means stepping back before the collapse begins rather than after. The crown was William's responsibility now, Charles told him in plain words. His son answered that his father's service would not be erased from anything. Anne's confirmation only made sense to most people once the shock had settled. She had not spoken to wound her brother or to elevate William for its own sake. She recorded a private statement and placed it before senior officials because confusion had become the greater threat. Catherine had already shaped the emotional verdict of the next reign before it started. She reminded William that firmness need not become cruelty, and he carried that into the first hours of leadership. Charles stepped aside with sorrow and without disgrace. William stepped forward with strength and without triumph. Anne made the truth undeniable and paid for it by being the one who said it. Catherine stood beside the future with a calm that cost her more than anyone outside that family will ever know. The monarchy did not avoid the pain. It found its direction by walking through the middle of it. And the part that stays with me is how quiet the whole thing was. No balcony announcement, no ceremony, no procession, no crowd on the Mall. A recorded statement played to a small group of officials, a folder carried down a corridor, a field deleted from a document template, a reign closed. That is how power changes hands in that building. The country only ever gets shown the version with the horses. The institution took Charles's whole life on the way in, and then it took the rest of it on the way out, and it never once slowed down long enough to say thank you. Thanks for watching. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.